Anyway, next up is Harry Barton from Devon Wildlife Trust, and it's a huge pleasure for me personally to introduce him, because I've known him quite a long time, and to see his sort of career blossom from those days at...
And most of the hay meadow in Dartmoor has disappeared some time ago, but there's a lovely hotspot around this area, and if we can restore all this to high quality hay meadow, we will double the area of hay meadow on this part of Dartmoor. And what birds could we expect to see? Well, you can imagine anything you like, but there's the windchat, the meadow pipit, the redstart, any number of birds might come, but at the moment we can't tell because we're very early in the process. Now, restoring existing sites is one thing. What excites me, to be honest, even more is when you can do something really novel, really new. Now, this is Meath Quarry, former quarry, 10 miles north of Dartmoor. It is an entirely artificial landscape. In the 1970s, this was just very bog standard agricultural fields. This lake in front of you here is 150 feet deep. It has risen 15 feet in the 3 years that we've owned this site. It's now overtopping, so it won't fill up anymore. It goes up and down a little bit winter, summer. But what's extraordinary about this landscape is that it is, in some ways, a scar. I think it's a scar that is half semi-healed. And to be honest, we want to keep it that way, because a semi-healed scar it's bumpy, it's unpredictable, it's full of variety. There is more habitat diversity on this 450-acre site than on any other site that we own in the Devon Wildlife Trust. And of those red birds, not 24, it's not quite up there with Emsworthy, but 18 birds on the red list are now at this site, and that's increasing year on year. And it will continue to increase because, of course, there is no large areas of standing open water, so to speak, in this part of Devon. So this is a new arrival, and the birds need to learn that it's here. And these are some of the birds, some of those 24. So hobbies, fantastic site for hobbies, and partly because there's so many dragonflies and damselflies thanks to all the wet patches. The green sandpiper, the goldcrest, they're not all wetland birds there, but very, very exciting. Now, there's so much you can do with sites that if you're serious about conserving and protecting Devon's birds, you've got to look beyond sites. Because if we even add a zero, you go from 50 to 500 nature reserves, we won't be anywhere near enough to tackle this problem of Devon's birds. So we at Devon Wildlife Trust are very interested in landscape scale conservation, landscape scale projects. And all our landscape scale projects, John Varley mentioned one earlier on, Greater Horseshoe Bats, which is just starting off, but all our conservation projects at a landscape scale rely on partnerships. If I was to show you the list of partners for this project alone, it would fill up a massive slide in the same way that Martin's did earlier on. So forgive me for not mentioning all the partners, but just please take it as read that partnership is absolutely critical. Now this one is the Northern Devon Nature Improvement Area, and it focuses on the River Torridge, famous for the Tarka. Now, the Biosphere Reserve, it's located within the Biosphere Reserve, and this is in many ways a unique thing in itself, because it was, when we got the grant for this, the only one in England. There is now another one in Sussex. But you've got Lundy in there in the top left-hand corner, the first marine nature reserve in the country. You've got part of 2 national parks. You've got in Braunton Burrows the UK's most biodiverse parish and one of the best dune systems in Europe. And then you've got the River Torridge, which is a beautiful river, but there's all sorts of problems, the kind of runoff problems that John Varley showed some great slides of earlier on in relation to the River Otter. So what are we focusing on in this project? Well, we've been focusing mainly on one particular habitat, and this is cool grassland. And let's face it, it's very beautiful, but it's also quite a melancholy habitat. It's very structurally diverse, it's wet, you can go for weeks and weeks without rain, and it's still very wet underfoot. And it's also, in some ways, quite an unwelcoming habitat, because you try walking across here, and you can't see it because of the long grass, but you try walking across that, and within seconds you'll fall flat on your face because it's so tussocky. So if Kevin Bishop does manage to get the Chancellor down here, perhaps this is a very good habitat to take into. But there we are, wonderful habitat. It doesn't always look as melancholy as this. It can look much more cheerful. So here is cool grassland in late May, early June. You can see some of that structural diversity, and it's so good at holding water. It's slightly untidy. And because of that, has all this wonderful wildlife around it. Now, we set out in this project to reconnect huge areas of cool grassland and wet woodland and other habitats as well, but particularly cool grassland. And I remember being in some terrible dragon's den situation trying to attract funding for this project a few years ago, and I'd made one of these stupid comments that you will immediately regret, thinking, why on earth did I say that? And I was asked, how will you know if you've been successful? And I sort of glibly said, well, make such an impact that you'll be able to see it from space. Yeah, we never managed to raise the money for that. This is a map of the landowners that we've managed to get to and influence. It's just over a fifth of them in the area. And this is in 3 years. Now, I'm pretty proud of this. I would be exaggerating if I said all those area in red had done a sort of George Monbiot and put all their land back to nature. That was never the aim of this. But all those areas in red are landowners, farmers who got engaged with this project, who've done something, restored hedges, put some habitat back, gone into agri-environment. So never let it be said that farmers are not interested in nature conservation. They are. And let me tell you, this is one of the toughest places to farm anywhere in the United Kingdom. So we're very pleased about that. And what sort of birds have benefited? Well, a whole lot. And you're all birders, you'll know the names of these birds better than I do. But particularly here, this one on the top right, the curlew. I think we can count the number of breeding curlew left in Devon now on one hand. But hope that this is just the sort of habitat that benefits these birds. Willow tip, another one. Now, concentration on stitching the landscape back together in terms of habitats is absolutely critical, but we've also got to look at its functionality. In Devon, you can't get away from water and rivers, and Devon is a really interesting place to look at water and rivers because we have so many rivers which rise in Devon and meet the sea also in Devon, the Dart being one of them, but one of them. Now, we work closely with South West Water and our friends Cornwall Wildlife Trust and West Country Rivers Trust on a project called Upstream Thinking. And I think, David, are you still here from South West Water?
Yes, sir.
You are? Hello. So we're very grateful. And what you need here is a really inspired utility company to see the light. And what Upstream Thinking does is it recognises that South West Water has to provide drinkable, high-quality water to customers. It also recognises that if you have a hilly county, which is very wet, lots of runoff, and heavily farmed, you are going to get agrochemicals ending up in the water supply. So can we close that loop and find a way to save money by helping farm in a way that leads to less agrochemicals going into the water supply? And this is exactly what Upstream Thinking is about. So our work here involves habitat restoration, changes in the time and the level of applications of agrochemicals, and a whole range of other things. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the impact of pesticides on, and not just pesticides, but agrochemicals generally, on birds. There was a very interesting study, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, that came out in July a year ago. And this was done in the Netherlands, I should stress, not in the UK, and certainly not in Devon. But it found with 50 insectivorous birds, including the swallow, that there was an average 3.5% decline per annum for all these birds in areas where certain types of neonicotinoids, in this case, were being applied at about a certain concentration. And more alarmingly still, they found that most of the farmers in this part of the Netherlands were using several times the amount of pesticide against this base level of concentration. So, okay, neonicotinoids aren't a particular problem in this part of Devon, but metaldehyde certainly is, and acid herbicides certainly are. So if we can reduce the amount going onto the ground and ending into water supply, what sort of birds will benefit? Well, again, here are some. Yellowhammer, swallow, mistle thrush, a whole range of birds, and many, many more besides. So it's too early to say what the impact of this work will be in terms of birds, but we've certainly seen the impact in many other ways, not least water quality. Now, I think we need to take things a step further again, though, because all these things that I talked about are about humans managing things. And I think we need to try and let go of the reins a little bit. An awful lot has been said about rewilding recently. It's the latest buzzword. And I personally find it exciting because my first job, before I was doing what Sam mentioned earlier, I'm working in CPO, my very first job in the sector was working for an organisation called Council for National Parks in 1992. And I wrote a paper about the possibilities of rewilding in national parks. So there's always been something close to my heart. But I think we have to be very, very careful what we talk about, what we mean, really, when we talk about rewilding. Now, this is a place, this isn't Devon, almost as good, not quite as good as Devon anyway. This is Irian Jaya, or now West Papua, so the Indonesian part of west of New Guinea. The mountains in the background are higher than the Alps, they're 16,000 feet high. This is the most incredible landscape you will see. It's so, the individual valleys are so separated that you get separations with people, and there are a greater concentration of languages here than any other place on Earth. I went for a helicopter trip to the top of this mountain here. This was in 1997. And the helicopter pilot showed me a map, and about a third of the centre of Irian Jaya just said, land unmapped between 2,000 and 7,000 feet above sea level. A few years before I went here, a plant collecting expedition found 1 in 5 plants that it collected was undescribed by science. So this is the kind of place you're looking at, a real wilderness. And yet, much as I will never ever forget my trip here, I have to say it left me in some ways slightly cold. And I think the reason it left me cold is that the landscape had an utter indifference to me as a Westerner. I felt really difficult identifying with it. It didn't leave me with warm emotions. Amazing, yes, but what it was like, it was completely alien. And I think we often forget that our whole relationship with the landscape around us and its wildlife is an emotional one and is a cultural one. And it's a difficult thing for us. Now, what's the greatest in scale rewilding project that's happened anywhere in Europe? Do you recognise this? Yeah, this is Chernobyl. So Chernobyl. Now, I haven't been here, but I know a few people who have, and they always say to me, it's incredible the amount of wildlife you get in a place like this. Of course, this is an area half the size of England. But this is on the back of the most appalling tragedy, human tragedy and an environmental tragedy. It's a really tense relationship here. And yet there's some hope in this slide as well, because it does show that all the buildings are still there, right? The people aren't, but the buildings are still there. So perhaps there are ways that wildlife can thrive with humans. Now, much closer to home, this is an aerial view of the floods in Somerset, and I'm not in any way making light of this because I think it will make nothing on the scale of Chernobyl. It was nevertheless an awful thing, and I hope it never happens again. But I remember going across the train on the way up to London, across this just about 2 days after they opened the line. And I took picture after picture of it because it was just the most incredible thing to see, this huge red inland sea. Now, I've no idea whether this was good or bad for wildlife. I expect some of its impacts were good and some of its impacts were bad. But what really struck me was not so much the incident itself, but it was our reaction to it. Not our, but the political, the wider world reaction to it. And the call was, we've got to dredge more, we've got to raise the levees, we've got to pump more, we've got to do all these interventions. And sometimes people didn't stop to say, well, perhaps that's not the problem, perhaps we're over-managing this landscape, perhaps we're doing too much in the wrong place, and perhaps we should be looking in the hills around this landscape, which are generating the water, which ends up in the middle here. So, I'm not proposing rewilding, but I am proposing taking our hands off the reins a little bit. Now, here's an example of how we do that, we might do that. Now, this is not what I would call a rewilding project. This is a 10-acre enclosure. John mentioned beavers earlier on. This isn't actually beavers on the River Otter, which is what all the publicity is about. This is beavers in a small enclosure in North Devon. We introduced them there about 5 years ago, just under. And at that time, this was a very sort of thickety area called scrubbed over with willow. There was a very small stream running through this site, no ponds or anything. And in that time, 2 beavers, and since a couple of kits, the female died, so most of the time it's been 3 animals there, 3 or 4 animals there. They have built 13 ponds. They have multiplied, I don't know how many, but it must be 10 or 20-fold the water storage capacity of this piece of land. And we're measuring very carefully what happens to the water that goes through here. And not only is it stored, but it comes out much better quality than it goes in. And the flow is much more even as well. So that's heartening. But we're going to be doing other things as well, because they've generated this much more dynamic mosaic, and that's benefited an awful lot of wildlife, in particular frogs. So look at this plan of this chart of how frog spawn has increased over the last 5 years. Now, I went there about 3 years ago, and we noticed a very, very strange thing. We found frog spawn all over the place, up on branches, right up in trees. The more we saw it, the more we just couldn't quite believe what was going on. And we thought, is it beavers doing this? Is it, dogs? What's going on? The children throwing this stuff around? And of course, what it turned out to be was that this was birds coming down. They were taking the frogs, frog spawn inside them, they were taking them up the trees, they were eating them, but they weren't eating the frog spawn, because what the frog spawn does is it absorbs the water and then it expands. So each of these clumps of frog spawn was the result of a female, pregnant female, being taken by a bird and eaten up in a tree. Sad for the frogs, but it's a good sign of what this beaver activity can do for bird life. Now, it's too early really to say what the impacts of beavers in Devon will be for birds, but we do know what they've been doing up in Scotland. And here again are some of the birds that have benefited in Scotland. So grey herons, that's one of the ones on the red list. I'm sure that was responsible for some of those poor old clumps of frog spawn. The red-breasted mergansers, goose sanders mentioned earlier on, a whole range of birds, snipe. And I think over the next 5-10 years we've got lots to learn about what these impacts will be. Now, going from areas that we want to let go of control over a bit into areas where we have practically no control whatsoever. The one habitat I think we're always in danger of forgetting about is marine. Now, we've got some amazing marine habitats here in southwest England, and they're very poorly studied on the whole. So the areas where we've got good photographs tend to be places like Plymouth Sound, where the water's fairly clear and fairly still, and you can get out there and dive. There are lots of parts of Devon where it's extremely difficult ever to get in the water because of the tides, the turbidity, etc. But extraordinary. Now, whatever anyone says, what we have done to our marine wildlife is just as shocking, if not more so, than what's happened to our terrestrial wildlife. So here is a picture of the biomass of fish in 1900. So this is total number of fish times total average size of fish. And you can see extraordinary levels of biomass, particularly off the northeast coast of the USA, but also all the way down the west coast of Europe and Western Africa. So the reds are the real hotspots, and as you get to purple and blue, there's still a lot, but not so much. So there we are, 1900. Oh dear, there we are in 2000. That's 2000. So there we are, the only bit where there's anything that's of any colour at all is just that little bit around Cape Cod and Newfoundland there. So thank goodness we've made some progress and we've got some marine conservation zones. They still cover a very small area, but there we are. You see the ones that are in blue down here. These are the ones we've already got. And hopefully, if we lobby hard enough, we'll get some of these yellow ones in the north. There's some bit of doubt over this one here north of Lundy, because that was designed to be around Atlantic Array, which of course is not going to be there anymore. Just make a note of that one, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Now, marine conservation zones are fantastic in all sorts of ways, but there are problems. Problem number one is they don't cover much of the sea. Problem number one is that we haven't got most of them yet. Assuming we get them. Problem number two is that we don't, but they still leave most of the sea unprotected. Problem number three is that they are designed really to protect things like this. And don't get me wrong, this is absolutely fantastic and it needs to be protected. But we're talking about protection of the sea floor, the reefs, the shifting muds, the canyons, etc. And of course, marine is a complex habitat with all sorts of things interacting with it. Now, this is a picture of Berry Head, which is just south of Tor Bay. And that area in Tor Bay I showed a couple of slides ago, that's eelgrass beds, and that's fantastic. You get seahorses there and all sorts, it's wonderful. But here at Berry Head, you also have some very important nesting colonies of guillemots, to name one of them. They are not protected. Now, should we not be looking at, so whether it's a marine conservation zone or something else, should we not be looking at a form of protection which recognises the bits on the land as well as the bits on the sea? Because what makes it special is not because it's sea or land, but because it's that sort of boundary habitat, if you like. And not just the residents of guillemots, but also the winter visitors, like these black-necked greens. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever read a book called The Sea Around Us by Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson is one of my environmental heroes. It's her first famous book. She's writing in the early 1950s. And she talked about this phenomenon here, which this slide shows, which is an ocean front. So at the moment we've got a big atmospheric front going over us, hence the rain. And you've got warm air meeting cold air, and the warm air is forced up and cools and rains, etc., etc. And exactly the same principle happens in oceans. And in this area here, which is off the northeast coast of the USA, this can be so intense that you can have the front and the back of the boat, although I think you call them the bow and the stern, the bow and the stern of the boat, and the water temperature can be 20 degrees Fahrenheit different. It's that sharp, the boundary. And Rachel Carson describes the upwelling being so strong that the sea was literally spewing up deep sea creatures everywhere. Now, 2 minutes, nearly gone. Now that's a phenomenon in itself, but what it means is that this upwelling means there's fantastic feeding opportunities for all sorts of megafauna. We've got lots of megafauna, marine megafauna around Devon. And there's one area just to the west of Lyme Bay, or to the east of Torbay, which we want to designate and throw into this mix of marine conservation zones. And it's this photo here, it's for the white-beaked dolphin. There are 17 other species, or 16 other species, of marine megafauna that would benefit from this if we designated this area, because at the moment it's totally unprotected. But it's not just the marine megafauna, it's also the birds. So here's one, the Balearic shearwater, which would benefit massively if we could designate some of these sites as well. So we need to up our game with marine conservation for birds as well. Now, I'm running out of time, got just under 2 minutes, so I just wanted to finish very quickly on the point on education, which is something Kevin wanted me to talk about. Here is a wonderful picture of a young girl enjoying wildlife. And I have to be a bit careful what I say, because we've used this in various publications. And there's all sorts of things about this picture which I love, because it illustrates joy and all that kind of thing. But look more closely, and I start to find myself criticising this picture, because here is a young girl in rather nice designer clothing, without a streak of mud anywhere on her. There are no birds in that picture for starters. And look at the landscape around. It's trees, it's a very, very heavily managed urban park. And great though it is, I'm sorry to say that most of our children now experience wildlife in this way, if they're not just experiencing it on screen. Oh, come on, this is not what our children should be doing. This is what our children should be doing. They should be throwing mud at each other. So here we are, this is National Paddy Day in Nepal. I'm sorry there aren't any birds in this either, but just imagine a wonderful flock of cranes circling above here. So, we need to get muddy, we need to get dirty, we need to get reconnecting in all sorts of ways with wildlife, as so many speakers have said. And I also think yes, of course we need our wildlife stats, we need our landscape scale projects, we need all these different things. But we need to be bold, we need to let go of control. Tidiness is a terrible enemy for wildlife. We need more mess. Birds can live quite happily in mess if you give them a chance. So here's to mud and stains and chaos and lack of control and ocean fronts and everything else. Thank you very much.